Hey, everybody, I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist. Today, I'm sharing some couch commentary. And when I do couch commentary, I talk about something that's going on in current events or pop culture from a psychological perspective. Today, I just wanted to share a few psychological thoughts on the new documentary called Kidnapped, Elizabeth Smart on Netflix. This is a documentary I can't recommend enough for people. This is ultimately, I believe, an incredibly inspiring documentary. This young girl had so much courage, and I just think it's amazing for people to be able to see it. So, who was Elizabeth Smart? Just a few kind of factual reminders. This is a girl who was abducted at 14 years old, just 14. She was abducted, pulled out of her house from her bedroom in Salt Lake City. This was in 2002. Her sister actually had been asleep at the time and woke up when the sister heard a man in their bedroom. And the sister watched this man take her daughter at knife point, holding a knife to Elizabeth's neck. Took Elizabeth out for 9 months until finally she was rescued. Just that she was rescued, what a miracle. And I want to share a few kind of points that really struck me so much about watching this. So, first of all, one thing that this documentary does a great job is showing the effect on family members when family members become a suspect unfairly when a child is either abducted or murdered, for example. It makes sense because so often statistically, a family member is involved in cases like this. Ed Smart was somebody that law enforcement were wondering whether he may have had some involvement. And the documentary goes into an explanation of why that is. Ed was interviewed in this documentary, and he talks about basically the double trauma, the trauma, one, of having your daughter be abducted, and then two, the pressure of feeling like the world is coming down on you and casting you as a guilty culprit, when his psychological defenses were at their absolute lowest, when he probably felt at his most hopeless. This documentary does a great job of explaining kind of what this is like for some of the family members when people cast doubts on them, what it's like for them psychologically while they're already dealing with such an incredible trauma themselves. He talks in the documentary about how he actually had a psychiatric hospitalization very early in the beginning because he was that overwhelmed. Another point that I saw in this documentary did such a good job. I almost sense that the director may have made an intentional goal to try to show this next point I'm going to say, but how unbelievably pressure filled this whole situation must have been on Elizabeth Smart's sister, the 9-year-old girl at the time. She was the only person who had witnessed actually what happened. She was the only person who actually saw who abducted Elizabeth. And so naturally, everybody turns to her to try to find out, can you please remember? Please remember. It's that important. Imagine a little tiny 9-year-old body holding that memory, holding that information. And it makes sense if law enforcement or family want to try to find out, want to try to, so to speak, get the information out of her. But think about the brain of a 9-year-old is not the brain of a 25-year-old mature adult. The 9-year-old brain is still developing, and emotionally, just from a developmental perspective, they simply do not have the coping mechanisms, the coping skills, the psychological resources to be able to handle the kinds of stress that an older teenager may, or of course, an adult. So there's a scene in this documentary, you see footage of her being questioned, this 9-year-old, and she is this tiny little body who is seated in this, what looks like this oversized chair, and she's being asked by some sort of professional to talk about what she remembered that night. This little body in that oversized chair, just that physical image, you can see the smallness of her and really how the world must have felt so gigantic and overwhelming for her at the time. And another thing that I thought the documentary did a really good job of is talking about or highlighting, I guess, how memory works in really pretty mysterious ways. Well, at some point, this was not immediately after, but later, remember that Elizabeth was gone for 9 months. She had been abducted for 9 months. Well, at some point during that 9 months, her sister remembered she was up in her bedroom and she talks about how one evening, one random evening, she was up in her bedroom and she was reading a book, just a random book. And all of a sudden, she talks about how a memory, a very specific memory, came back to her that would become very important. That is such an important point for people to remember, for any of us to remember when we go through traumatic events. The way that memory works is really not always linear. It's certainly not always predictable. And sometimes memories of very specific traumatic situations can come back in really unexpected ways. And then finally, the third point that I just wanted to share is what a great job this documentary does in exposing not just, I would say, the benefits of hope or faith. A lot of times when people talk about faith, they think about faith only as a religious experience, faith being religious. And yet, for some people, it is. For some people, they do practice a religious faith, they do have a religious faith, but there are others who have a faith that is not religious based. I think this documentary really shows the importance of having some kind of faith, whether religious or otherwise, having some sort of faith that if a person maintains and holds on to hope, that there is this generative, positive, organizing force of the universe that people can invest in, people can continue to have hope for in the face of just the most horrific events happening to them. I always say as a psychologist, some people say that having a positive attitude is a choice. I actually believe that there isn't a choice at all. That's the way that we need to think, the mindset that we need to have psychologically about hope is that being positive and being hopeful, no matter what's happening in your life, it is not a choice. There's no other choice. What would be the alternative? The key, I believe, psychologically is to say positive attitudes aren't a choice at all. It's the only option we really truly have. I can't recommend this documentary enough. Really, this documentary shows just how resilient young people can be. And I think it's amazing when adults can learn from young people. So often in the structures, the sort of power hierarchical structures we have in life, adults are always the one in authority. Adults are usually the ones in situations of power. In school environments for children, they're in power. In home environments, the parents are the one who are higher in the hierarchy and have the power. But this is a reminder of what adults can learn from a child. And that's what Elizabeth Smart was at 14 years old. One of the things as I close that I thought was most beautiful about this documentary is her talking about how she did it, how she actually kept going in the face of all of the horrific assaults that she was experiencing day to day at the hands of her two captors. She shared how she thought about family during some of the worst times, during some of the worst days in the assaults. She thought about family. That's what helped to keep her going. And specifically, she said this. She said that she found something that was, quote, worth surviving for, unquote. She found something that was worth surviving for because survival is a practice. Survival is an act of power and discipline in those moments for people who are experiencing traumas like that. And she found a way to get through it. I can't, like I said, recommend this documentary enough. Check out this documentary on Netflix. It is just food for the soul. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist.